December 19th, 1944. 6:30 in the morning. A requisition schoolhouse in Verdun, France. The same town where French and German armies had consumed each other through 10 months of 1916, where the ground beneath the flagstones still held corroded metal from that slaughter. Eisenhower had called a crisis conference, and the men who filed in around the map table carried the weight of what had happened 3 days before. On December 16th, German Army Group B had thrown more than 80 divisions against a thinly held sector of the American line in the Ardennes. The 1st SS Panzer Division had already reached Stavelot. The 2nd SS Panzer Division was approaching the large fuel depot at Stavelot when an American infantry platoon managed to delay it long enough for engineers to destroy the stores. The 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, had torn through multiple American positions and was driving west toward the Meuse River, its lead elements covering ground that Allied planning had assumed would take weeks to contest. The strategic port of Antwerp sat 60 miles beyond that river. If Germany reached Antwerp, the Allied supply system, already stretched from the Normandy beaches, would fracture beyond repair. The generals around the map had no good news to offer. The Belgian market town of Bastogne, sitting at the junction of 7 critical roads in the Ardennes, was surrounded, or nearly so. The 101st Airborne Division, pulled from rest billets at Mormillon-le-Grand and trucked north in open vehicles without winter equipment, had arrived just in time to establish a perimeter. Outside that perimeter, von Manteuffels' armor was closing from multiple directions. Eisenhower turned to his commanders and asked which of them could launch a counterattack northward into the German southern flank. And when? If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. The room considered the question in silence. What Eisenhower was asking for was an operation of extreme complexity. The Third Army, under Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr., was currently engaged along a front facing east and southeast, stretching from the Saar region into Luxembourg. To attack northward into the Ardennes, Patton would need to disengage multiple divisions from active contact with the enemy, rotate them 90 degrees through roads already choked with retreating American units and civilian refugees, move them into new assembly areas and temperatures that had fallen below freezing and were still dropping, and attack with supply lines that would have to be reconstructed on the move through terrain that the maps underrepresented and the ground made consistently worse. By the calculations of experienced staff officers, this operation would require 10 days at minimum. Some in the room thought 2 weeks was the honest answer. Patton said 48 hours. The response was not applause. Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group and knew Patton's habits as well as any officer alive, later wrote that even he found the answer close to reckless. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied forces to the north and openly skeptical of American operational improvisation, made no effort to conceal his doubt. Among German commanders on the other side of the line, when the Third Army's movement actually began and its speed became apparent through reconnaissance reports and prisoner interrogations, the professional reaction was something the post-war records document plainly. Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most accomplished operational commanders, a man who had fought through the Eastern Front campaigns and understood armored movement at the highest level, would say after the war that the Third Army's reorientation was unlike anything his staff had considered achievable within that time frame. His planning had not accounted for it. The German estimate had been built on a reasonable foundation. German operational doctrine required that a major reorientation of forces be preceded by thorough preparation, confirmed road reconnaissance, established supply dumps within range of the new axis, artillery positions surveyed and registered, signal communications laid along the new line of advance. Each of these steps took time. The total minimum preparation period before a division could be considered ready to attack in a new direction was measured in days, not hours. Moving 3 divisions simultaneously through 90 degrees in winter against the friction of an active front fell outside the range of what German staff methodology would allow an operational planner to propose. A staff officer who submitted such a timeline in a German planning session would have been corrected or replaced before the proposal reached the Army Group commander. What German planning did not account for was that the 48-hour answer was not improvised. Patton had anticipated the German attack. He had not known its exact date, axis, or scale. The SHEF intelligence staff had not predicted it. The First Army's G2 section had seen warning indicators that were misread or set aside, partly because the Ardennes had been quiet for months, and the assumption of quiet had hardened into habit. What Patton had was different. In late November and early December, he had been watching the Ardennes sector and registering what he described in his diary as a dangerous quiet. The German line, there was not being pressed by American forces, and it was not pressing back. When a front goes quiet without an obvious explanation, it means one of two things: the enemy is spent, or the enemy is building. His intelligence officer, Brigadier General Oscar Koch, had been tracking German Panzer and Volksgrenadier divisions that had dropped off the line without reappearing elsewhere. Divisions that vanished from contact in one sector usually reappeared in another within days. These had not. Koch was mapping their probable locations against the rail and road networks east of the Ardennes, and the pattern that emerged pointed to the Eifel region, directly behind the quiet front. On December 9th, a week before the offensive began, Koch presented his analysis to Patton. His assessment was that a German buildup was occurring and that a westward strike into the Ardennes was a genuine operational possibility in the near term. Patton had the warning. He did not have certainty. What he did with it was construct 3 contingency plans for a northward attack, each built around a different combination of available divisions, each designed to be executable on short notice. Road networks were identified and photographed. Assembly areas were surveyed and designated. Logistics chains were worked out on paper, including fuel and ammunition requirements for each division over the first 5 days of movement. Movement orders were drafted in full and held, waiting for a trigger. On December 16th, when German guns opened across the Ardennes and the offensive became real, Patton called his staff together and told them to begin preparing execution of one of the contingency plans. On December 17th, the second day of the German advance, he issued preliminary movement orders to the divisions involved. On December 18th, one day before Eisenhower called the Verdun Conference, the Third Army's forward elements were already shifting north, occupying the assembly areas that had been designated weeks before. When Patton told Eisenhower 48 hours, the trucks were already moving. The operational scope of what followed is recorded in the Third Army's G3 journal for that period, a document that runs to dozens of pages and captures the volume of orders issued in those days. Division after division, regiment after regiment, artillery battalion after artillery battalion redirected northward along road networks that Patton's staff had already mapped toward assembly areas designated weeks before. The machinery behind the promise had been built before the crisis made the promise necessary. 3 divisions formed the core of the attack: the 4th Armored, the 80th Infantry, and the 26th Infantry. The 4th Armored, under Major General Hugh Gaffey, would lead. It was one of the most experienced armored formations in the American order of battle, hardened through the Normandy breakout and across France to the Saar. Its crews knew what it meant to operate a Sherman in temperatures that thickened the engine oil, cracked the track grease, and reduced a man sleeping on the ground to a medical case within hours. They also knew how to keep moving through conditions that stopped less experienced units. The roads they were given ran north through terrain that in an ordinary December would have been hard. In December of 1944, after weeks of rain followed by a sharp freeze, they were something else entirely. Mud that had rutted under vehicle traffic had locked into ridges that bent axles and destroyed suspensions. Ice lay under a thin coating of fresh snow that made it invisible until a wheel found it. Surfaces that appeared passable in aerial photographs were treacherous at ground level. Supply columns moving at night without headlights, in compliance with blackout rules, were navigating by memory and by the vehicle ahead. The temperature was still falling. German operational planning had calculated that a coherent American attack northward could not begin before December 22nd at the earliest. A fully coordinated assault with adequate supply support, the kind of attack German doctrine required before committing armored formations to offensive action, would not be ready before Christmas. The Third Army attacked on December 22nd. The movement of those 3 divisions in 4 days is one of the logistical records of the European campaign. Nearly 200,000 men, along with their vehicles, artillery, ammunition, fuel, and medical equipment, redirected through a region whose road network had not been built to handle the weight of an armored force. Engineers worked around the clock to reinforce bridges, fill craters, and reroute traffic around bottlenecks. Military police stood at every intersection in the dark, without lights, directing columns by hand signal and voice. Trucks broke down and were pushed to the shoulder. Fresh vehicles came up from the rear to replace them. The columns did not stop. The German assessment that this movement was impossible in this time had assumed it would proceed at the pace of organized peacetime logistics. It did not proceed at that pace. It proceeded at the pace Patton's headquarters demanded, which was higher than the theoretical maximum, and which the men in those columns achieved because they had been trained to treat any alternative as unacceptable. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and the attached forces of Combat Command via the 10th Armored Division held a perimeter roughly 16 miles around. Artillery ammunition was being rationed by gun per day, with battery commanders submitting requests through battalion for approval before firing. There was almost no winter clothing. Soldiers who had been trucked north from rest billets were fighting in the same uniforms they had arrived in. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. On December 21st, the last road into Bastogne was cut. The town was fully encircled, and its radio traffic to higher headquarters was the only connection to the outside. On December 22nd, a German officer arrived at the American lines under a white flag, carrying a formal surrender demand. The document informed the American commander that further resistance would lead to annihilation. It was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st. His written reply was one word: nuts. The German officers who received it required a translation. The American officer who provided it described its meaning as the equivalent of go to hell. The weather over the Ardennes remained closed. Allied air forces had been grounded for a week. Patton, known for elaborate personal preparations before major operations, had his chaplain compose a prayer for favorable weather and had it printed and distributed across the Third Army's troops, 100,000 copies. The sky stayed gray. The 4th Armored pushed north through Argonne toward the forest terrain south of Bastogne. The division advanced in columns of the ground forced in a single-axis movement, because the pine forest and frozen swamp on either side of every road could not be crossed by tracked vehicles without losing time that did not exist. German infantry and anti-tank guns held every choke point. Combat Command A attacked along the western axis. Combat Command B pressed the eastern route. The fighting was close and costly. Infantry and armor working together through terrain that suited neither, with frost on the optical sights and crews who had not slept in 48 hours working ammunition that had been stored in open vehicles through 2 nights below zero. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. By December 23rd, both combat commands had taken significant losses in killed, wounded, and vehicles. The ground south of Bastogne channeled every attack into positions that the German 5th Parachute Division and elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier had organized with care. Anti-tank guns were positioned on reverse slopes, hidden from the advancing armor, until a Sherman crested a rise and presented its belly to the gun. The frozen ground defeated every attempt at flanking. Roads passable for infantry were not passable for armor at any speed matching Patton's requirements. Engineers moving ahead of the armor columns were working to repair bridges that the Germans had demolished, in temperatures that froze the water pumped from stream crossings before it cleared the pipes. Patton knew the pace. He drove to the front on December 23rd and 24th, appearing at command posts, adjusting priorities, pushing supply columns forward, insisting on pressure across every available axis. His visits were not theater. He was reading terrain that maps could not convey, gathering information that did not exist in radio traffic, making decisions that required authority and speed in combination. On one visit, he arrived at a command post to find a regimental commander who had halted his advance to wait for a bridge to be repaired. Patton told him to find another way and told him how. On December 23rd, the overcast broke. The temperature fell further, which hardened the ground and cleared the sky from horizon to horizon for the first time in 8 days. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings from a 9 Tactical Air Command descended on the German columns that had been moving freely under cloud cover since December 16th. The roads west and north of Bastogne, packed with von Manteuffel supply convoys and infantry formations, were hit repeatedly through the day and the following days. The damage to German logistics was severe. The Panzer units that had outrun their supply lines in the offensive's first rush now found those lines cut or burning from the air. Inside Bastogne on December 23rd, C-47 transport aircraft made the first supply drops under fire from German anti-aircraft positions, ringing the perimeter. 11 aircraft were lost. The bulk of the cargo reached the American lines. Ammunition, surgical equipment, and blood plasma reached the aid stations that had been working without them for 3 days. The corridor into Bastogne was still closed. Von Manteuffel's plan had not accounted for this attack at this speed. The 5th Panzer Army's southern flank, held by infantry without armored reserve, had been designed to stop a force that could not possibly arrive until well after Christmas. What was arriving instead was the 4th Armored Division in the 3rd week of December, pushing through the forest roads with its fuel and ammunition forward-loaded, and its infantry riding the tank hulls because the half-tracks could not keep pace on the frozen and cratered surface. On December 24th, Patton told Bradley he intended to concentrate his remaining armored strength on a single axis and force the breakthrough regardless of what it cost in flexibility elsewhere along the front. The conversation, recorded by witnesses at 3rd Army headquarters, made clear that Patton considered the relief of Bastogne the overriding operational priority and was prepared to press the argument at any level of command required. He was given what he needed. Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, was the element that made the final push. Abrams was 30 years old. He had commanded armor through France and into the Saar and had a reputation in the division for keeping his task force moving when other commands stopped to reorganize. He would later command the United States Army in Vietnam, and a tank would carry his name. In December of 1944, he was pressing his column north through Belgian forest roads with the focus and forward momentum that Patton's command culture had made the standard of his division. December 25th passed in hard fighting. No breakthrough. Abrams's lead elements were 7 miles from Bastogne. December 26th. Combat Command B reached the hamlet of Assenois, 3 miles south of the Bastogne perimeter, at approximately 4 in the afternoon. A task force under Captain William Dwight, 5 Sherman tanks and a company of armored infantry, attacked straight up the road toward the American lines with artillery firing close ahead of them into the German positions at Assenois. The defenders, caught between the advancing armor and the artillery working across their position, broke or surrendered. At approximately 4:50, Dwight's lead tank reached the southwest corner of the Bastogne perimeter and found American soldiers waiting on the other side. They were engineers from the 326th Airborne, part of the defense since the first day of the encirclement. Dwight drove to McAuliffe's command post and shook his hand. The corridor was open, narrow, exposed on both flanks, passable only by single vehicles moving slowly, still under German artillery fire, but open. The siege of Bastogne was not finished. German forces attacked the perimeter repeatedly through early January, and the corridor remained contested and under fire for days after December 26th. The town did not exit danger fully until the German offensive in the Ardennes was reversed across a broader front through the first weeks of 1945. But the encirclement had been broken. The 7 roads through Bastogne stayed in American hands. The Battle of the Bulge continued until January 25, 1945, costing the United States Army roughly 80,000 casualties across its full extent. The German losses, complicated by incomplete records and the deliberate destruction of unit files in the war's final months, have been estimated between 60,000 and 100,000, spread across divisions that Hitler had stripped from every other front to arm his last Western offensive. The force Germany spent in the Ardennes, its final strategic reserve of experienced armor and infantry, was gone. The German army in the West never rebuilt what it lost in that campaign. 3 months after Bastogne, the 3rd Army crossed the Rhine. What German commanders wrote and said about those 10 days, in their wartime reports and in post-war testimony given to historians over the following decades, constitutes one of the more revealing bodies of evidence about the gap between Allied and German operational practice by late 1944. Von Manteuffel was consistent across multiple post-war interviews. The speed of the 3rd Army's reorientation had no precedent in his experience. He had commanded on the Eastern Front, where armored forces routinely covered vast distances at high speed. He had seen what German operational planning could achieve at its best. He said it anyway. The movement of Patton's forces fell outside what his staff's calculations had produced as a possibility. Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division and whose forces had been pressing Bastogne from the west, described the American relief operation in his post-war testimony with a directness that historians have returned to repeatedly. By German operational standards, he said, such a proposal would not have survived a planning session. A reorientation of 3 divisions through 90 degrees, an attack launched in 48 hours, through that terrain, in those conditions, without the preparation time that German doctrine defined as minimum. Such a plan rested on conditions that could not be guaranteed. A German officer who submitted, it would have been regarded as someone whose professional judgment could not be trusted with an army. His career would have ended before the attack began. Bayerlein was not calling Patton reckless. He was describing a different system, one built on different assumptions about what constituted an acceptable basis for action. German doctrine prized certainty. It required confirmation of conditions before committing forces to any operation of this scale. A plan that depended on weather breaking, on frozen roads holding under armored traffic, on supply chains maintaining coherence through a rapid shift of axis, on 3 divisions sustaining momentum through terrain that the ground made harder than the maps indicated. That plan rested on conditions that could not be guaranteed in advance. Plans built on unguaranteed conditions were not submitted by German officers who intended to remain in command. Patton was not operating by that standard. He was operating on a standard that his staff had built through months of contingency preparation, of planning before conditions were known, on the understanding that ideal conditions for action arrived after the opportunity had already passed. Koch's intelligence work, in early December, created the analytical foundation. The 3 contingency plans drafted before the offensive gave the movement orders a template to execute against rather than a problem to solve from a standing start. The preliminary orders issued on December 16th and 17th meant that when Eisenhower asked the question on December 19th, the answer was already being driven down frozen Belgian roads by men who had not been told yet why they were going north. The relief of Bastogne cost the 4th Armored Division more than 1,000 casualties in the operation period. That figure is in the unit's after-action report, held in the National Archives, 47 pages that document the routes taken, the ammunition expended, the vehicles lost, and the names of the men who did not come back, recorded in the flat and precise language that American military record-keeping maintained even through conditions that made the writing of anything at all an act of will. Patton died in Heidelberg on December 21st, 1945, 12 days after sustaining injuries in a car accident near Mannheim. He had been relieved of the 3rd Army Command 2 months earlier, in October, after making public statements about Allied denazification policy that contradicted official directives. He was 60 years old. He had commanded the 3rd Army from August of 1944, and in that time it had advanced further and faster than any army in the European theater, covering more ground and taking more prisoners than any other formation on the Western Front. He did not command troops in combat again after October of 45, and given what he was, he would not have one of the months that followed. He was buried at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the men of the 3rd Army, at his own request. Creighton Abrams became Army Chief of Staff. Oscar Koch wrote a detailed account of the Ardennes operation from the 3rd Army's intelligence perspective, published years after the war, that remains a primary source for historians of the campaign. Hugh Gaffey commanded the 3rd Army briefly in the months after Patton's death. Von Manteuffel lived until 1978 and gave extensive interviews through his later years to historians and documentary filmmakers. He was consistent about what had surprised him in the Ardennes. The 3rd Army speed was always on the list. He used the phrase outside calculation, meaning outside any calculation his staff had run using established German operational methodology. The implication was not that the Americans were lucky. It was that they were operating by different rules, and that those rules had produced an outcome German planning could not have accounted for, because German planning's assumptions about what was achievable had been built on German experience, and Patton was not operating from German experience. He was right about the calculation. The formula German staff work used in 1944 would not have produced that timeline, because the formula was built on assumptions about preparation time, about the relationship between conditions and action that did not match how Patton's staff had constructed their system. The contingency plans, Koch's early warning, the preliminary orders issued before the crisis was formally declared. None of that was visible to German intelligence. What was visible was the result. 3 divisions rotating 90 degrees and attacking in 48 hours through conditions that German doctrine classified as prohibitive for operations of this scale. The schoolhouse in Verdun where Eisenhower asked the question still stands. The road through Assenois that Dwight's Shermans drove on the afternoon of December 26th is a secondary road now, bordered by pine forest that has grown back over what the ground remembers. The corridor that opened that evening was narrow enough that vehicles had to move through it singly, and it remained under German fire for days. The men who held it are in the records, and in the letters their families kept, and in the after-action reports filed before the ink had time to dry. There is a further detail in the Third Army record worth holding. Among the movement orders issued between December 16th and December 19th, before the Verdun Conference, before Eisenhower formally requested the attack, are logistics estimates for fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure covering the first week of northward operations. Patton's staff had already calculated what the attack would cost in supply before the attack had been authorized. The conference at Verdun was where the decision was announced. The preparation that made the decision possible had been completed in the days before anyone in that room was told it was going to be necessary. What happened between December 19th and December 26th, 1944 was not a gamble by a general who dismissed the odds. It was the output of a system built to act before certainty was available, on the understanding that in the Ardennes in that December, certainty was not coming, and Bastogne could not wait for it. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.